There are moments in life that don't feel loud when they happen, moments that don't come with shouting or tears or chaos, but instead arrive quietly, almost gently, and yet somehow manage to divide a life into two completely different halves, before and after. For Iris Vex, that moment began on a rainy evening that looked no different from any other, the kind of night where the city blurred behind streaks of water on glass and people hurried past each other without ever truly seeing anything at all. She sat alone by the window of a small cafe tucked away from the main road, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, her expression calm in a way that most people would mistake for peace, but in truth, it was something else entirely. It was discipline, the kind that had been taught, shaped, and perfected over years of learning how to exist without ever revealing too much of herself. For 3 years, Iris had lived like this, moving carefully through a marriage that was never built on love but on necessity, on an agreement between two powerful families who preferred stability over conflict, silence over war. Ronan Vex had been part of that agreement, a man admired in public and unquestioned in private, someone who carried power like it belonged to him by right, someone who had never once needed to ask for anything because the world around him simply adjusted to his presence. And Iris, in contrast, had become the quiet balance to his arrogance, the composed wife who never interrupted, never argued, never demanded more than what was given. To outsiders, they looked perfect, untouchable even, but perfection, as Iris had come to understand, was often just a well-maintained illusion. At first, she had noticed the small things, the way Ronan's attention drifted too easily, the way conversations with her ended faster than they should, the way decisions were made without her presence as if her role in his life was something decorative rather than essential. None of it had been loud enough to confront, none of it serious enough to break the fragile peace their marriage was built on, and so she had done what she always did, she adjusted, she adapted, she remained silent. Because silence, in her world, was not weakness. It was strategy. But what she didn't realize, not at first, was that silence has a cost, and over time, that cost becomes something you can no longer ignore. That night, as the rain grew heavier, her eyes drifted toward the street almost absent-mindedly, following the glow of headlights reflecting against wet pavement, until something familiar caught her attention, not because she was looking for it, but because some part of her had already recognized it before her mind had the chance to process it. The car slowed, sleek and unmistakable even under the dim streetlights, a black Maserati that she knew better than she knew her own reflection, because it belonged to him. Ronan. For a moment, nothing happened. The world didn't stop, the rain didn't pause, the cafe didn't fall silent. Everything continued exactly as it should, as if this moment held no importance at all. But Iris didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't look away, didn't prepare herself for what might come next. She simply watched. The passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out, elegant, confident, the kind of woman who didn't hesitate when she moved, who didn't question her place in that moment. Iris didn't recognize her, but she didn't need to. Recognition wouldn't have changed anything. What mattered was what came after. Ronan leaned toward her, casual, unhurried, as if he had done this 100 times before, as if there was nothing about this moment that required secrecy or caution. And then he kissed her. Not quickly. Not nervously. Not like a mistake. But like it meant nothing. And that was the part that stayed. Because betrayal, when it's careless, when it's effortless, when it doesn't even try to hide, it doesn't feel like heartbreak. It feels like clarity. Iris didn't cry. She didn't look away. She didn't even tighten her grip around the cup in her hands. Instead, she sat there, perfectly still, watching the moment pass like it had nothing to do with her, even though it had everything to do with her. 3 years of quiet compromise, 3 years of choosing peace over truth, and for what? For a man who didn't even consider the possibility that she might see him, that she might know. The car drove away a moment later, disappearing into the rain as if nothing had happened, as if it had never been there at all. And for a brief second, everything returned to normal, the soft murmur of voices, the clinking of cups, the steady rhythm of a world that didn't care about the small, invisible fractures forming in someone else's life. That's enough, Iris said softly, her voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the sound of rain. But she heard it. And that was all that mattered. Because that sentence wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. When she left the cafe, she didn't rush. She didn't call him. She didn't replay the moment in her head the way most people would, searching for explanations or excuses or anything that might soften what she had seen. There was no need for that. She understood exactly what it was, exactly what it meant, and more importantly, exactly what she was going to do next. The house was silent when she returned, large and immaculate in a way that felt more like a display than a home, every object in its place, every surface untouched by anything that might suggest real life existed there. She walked through it without turning on the lights, her steps quiet, deliberate, as if she had already separated herself from it, as if she no longer belonged to the space she had spent 3 years inhabiting. At the end of the hallway, she stopped in front of a door that had always remained closed, not because she wasn't allowed inside, but because she had never needed to go in before. Ronan's study. For a moment, she simply stood there, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Then, without hesitation, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small key, simple, unremarkable, something that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who didn't know what it was for. It was a key she had possessed long before she ever stepped into this house, long before she ever became Iris Vex. The lock clicked open with a soft, almost insignificant sound, but in that moment, it felt like something much larger, a door not just to a room, but to a truth that had been waiting patiently to be uncovered. Inside, everything was exactly as she expected, organized, controlled, precise. Ronan's world, reduced to documents and numbers and decisions that he believed no one else would ever fully understand. Iris closed the door behind her, stepping into the room not as a wife, but as something else entirely, something he had never taken the time to recognize. She moved without hesitation, her eyes scanning the space with quiet efficiency, taking in every detail, every possible point of interest, because this wasn't unfamiliar territory to her. This was something she had been trained for, something that had been part of her long before this marriage ever existed. Her memory didn't work the way most people's did, it didn't forget, didn't blur, didn't lose detail over time. It stored everything, precisely, permanently, like a system designed to observe and retain. The drawer opened, revealing neatly arranged files, financial records, transaction logs, names and numbers that, to most people, would have taken hours or even days to fully process. Iris didn't need that kind of time. She read, and she remembered. Every account, every connection, every inconsistency hidden beneath the surface of what looked like legitimate business. Patterns began to form almost immediately, threads connecting in ways that made the bigger picture clearer with each passing second. She wasn't angry. That was the surprising part. There was no rush, no emotional reaction driving her movements. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, focus. Because what she was doing wasn't revenge. It was preparation. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. She was dismantling. Piece by piece. Without noise. Without warning. And by the time she finished, nothing in the room looked any different. The files were back in place, the drawer closed, the surface untouched, as if no one had ever been there at all. But everything had changed, because now she knew exactly who Ronan Vex really was, not the man he showed the world, but the one hidden behind carefully constructed layers of control. And knowledge, as she had always known, was the most powerful weapon anyone could possess. The next morning, when Iris Vex walked into the office of Marguerite Hales, she did so with the same calm composure she carried everywhere else, her posture straight, her expression neutral, giving nothing away to anyone who might try to read her. Marguerite, a woman who had spent decades navigating the complexities of power and law, looked up as Iris entered, her eyes sharp, observant, immediately recognizing that this was not a casual visit. "Mrs. Vex," she greeted, her tone polite but measured. "Not for long," Iris replied. There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. And in that moment, Marguerite understood something important. This was not a woman seeking advice. This was a woman executing a decision. "I'll need everything," Marguerite said after a brief pause, her gaze steady. Iris placed a folder on the desk, her movements precise, controlled. "You already have it." Marguerite opened it, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she scanned the contents, recognizing the level of detail, the depth of information, the kind of preparation that didn't happen overnight. This wasn't a reaction to betrayal. This was something else entirely. Something planned. Something deliberate. What exactly do you want? Marguerite asked, closing the folder slowly. Iris met her gaze without hesitation. I want him removed, she said softly. A pause. Completely. And somewhere, far beyond what Ronan Vex could see or understand, the first move had already been made. Because what he didn't know was, the woman he had ignored for 3 years had just started a war he would never be prepared to fight. There are people in this world who inherit power, and there are those who are shaped by it long before they ever step into it. The difference is subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but it defines everything when the moment comes to act. Iris had never needed to prove who she was, not to Ronan, not to anyone in his world, because for 3 years she had chosen to remain unseen, to exist as something small, something unthreatening, something easy to overlook. But what Ronan never understood, what he never even considered, was that being overlooked was not the same as being insignificant. And now, for the first time since their marriage began, Iris was no longer interested in remaining invisible. 3 days after that rainy evening, she found herself sitting in a place that could not have been more different from the life she had been living, a small Italian restaurant hidden away from the polished streets and controlled environments that defined Ronan's world. The lighting was warm, the air carried the scent of food made with patience rather than precision, and the quiet hum of conversation felt real in a way her own home never had. This was not a place of power. It was a place of truth. And that was exactly why she had chosen it. You took longer than I expected. The voice came from across the table, low and calm, carrying a weight that did not need to be emphasized. Iris didn't react immediately, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the glass in front of her, her posture relaxed in a way that might have seemed casual to anyone else, but was in fact carefully measured. Only after a moment did she lift her gaze. I gave it the time it deserved, she replied. Darius Vale studied her in silence, not just listening to her words, but observing everything else. The stillness in her shoulders, the steadiness of her breathing, the absence of anything that might suggest hesitation or regret. He had not seen her in months, not properly, not without the presence of others and the expectations that came with them, but this version of his daughter was familiar to him in a way the quiet wife of Ronan Vex had never been. This was the person he had raised. Not soft, not fragile, but controlled in a way that made emotion optional rather than unavoidable. And now, he asked. Iris held his gaze, unflinching. Now I'm done. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of the moment that had led her here, no sign that anything had broken or shattered inside her. If anything, she seemed clearer, more focused, as if something that had once been blurred had finally come into sharp definition. Darius leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know him well. You could walk away, he said after a moment, his tone even. Cleanly. Quietly. Leave him to whatever future he creates for himself. I could, Iris agreed, and for a brief second, her gaze dropped to the table, not in uncertainty, but in consideration, as if she were acknowledging the possibility rather than weighing it. Then she looked back up. But I won't. That was all he needed to hear. Because there was a difference between someone reacting to pain and someone acting with purpose, and Iris had never been the former. You intend to dismantle him, Darius said. I intend to remove him, she corrected calmly, her voice soft but precise. Carefully. That word lingered between them, carrying more meaning than anything else she had said. This was not about anger, not about humiliation or revenge. This was about consequence, delivered in a way that would leave no room for recovery, no opportunity to rebuild what had been taken apart. Darius's fingers tapped lightly once against the table, a subtle indication of thought. And you want to do it alone? Yes. There was no hesitation in her answer, no need to justify it. She wasn't asking for help. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating a fact. Silence settled over the table for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was measured, intentional, like everything else about this conversation. Finally, Darius nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of complete understanding. Then do it properly, he said. It wasn't approval. It wasn't instruction. It was something far more significant. It was trust. And with that, the conversation moved on, not because the subject had changed, but because everything that mattered had already been said. When Iris left the restaurant, the world outside felt different, not because anything had changed, but because she had. The hesitation that once existed had been replaced with certainty, the quiet acceptance she had carried for 3 years replaced with something sharper, something far more dangerous. She was no longer maintaining peace. She was preparing to end something that should never have lasted this long. The days that followed were quiet, almost deceptively so. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. Iris still appeared when she was expected to, still moved through social events with the same composed elegance that had always defined her presence, still stood beside Ronan when required, her expression unreadable, her demeanor unchanged. To anyone watching, she was still the same woman she had always been. But beneath that carefully maintained image, everything was shifting. It began with small movements, things too subtle to attract attention. Minor financial adjustments that looked routine, accounts that were closed and reopened under different names, assets that were transferred through layers of ownership so complex they became invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. These weren't drastic changes. They weren't meant to be. They were precise, calculated steps designed to alter the structure of something without drawing attention to the process. And then there were the people. Loyalty, Iris understood, was rarely permanent. It was influenced by security, by opportunity, by the simple instinct to survive. Ronan believed his people were loyal because he paid them well, because he held power, because he had never given them a reason to question their position. But he had also never considered what might happen if someone offered them something better. One by one, small shifts began to occur. A driver who had worked for Ronan for years suddenly received an offer that was too good to refuse and left without hesitation. A manager stepped down unexpectedly, citing personal reasons that no one questioned. A supplier delayed a shipment just long enough to create inconvenience, not enough to raise alarm, but enough to disrupt the rhythm Ronan relied on. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together, they began to form a pattern. And Iris watched it all unfold without interference, without urgency, because she understood that timing was everything. There was no need to rush something that was already inevitable. Late one evening, as the city settled into the quiet hours of the night, Iris stood alone in her room, a suitcase resting on the bed in front of her. It wasn't large, wasn't filled with unnecessary things, because she wasn't leaving with the intention of starting over from nothing. She was leaving with everything that mattered already secured. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the details she had once lived among, the objects that had been part of a life she no longer recognized as her own. She reached out, picking up a necklace Ronan had given her once, expensive, carefully chosen, completely meaningless. For a moment, she held it between her fingers, examining it not for what it was, but for what it represented. Then, without hesitation, she set it back down. She took nothing that belonged to him. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. By the time the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, Iris was ready. The house was silent as she walked through it one last time, her step steady, her expression unchanged. There was no reason to look back, no reason to hesitate, because everything that connected her to this place had already been severed. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin, the sound of the city beginning to wake in the distance. Behind her, the door closed softly, a quiet, almost insignificant sound that marked the end of something that had lasted far longer than it should have. And just like that, Iris Vex was gone. No note. No explanation. No trace. Only absence. And what Ronan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand yet, was that this wasn't an escape. It was the final step of a plan that had already been set in motion. Because while he continued to move through his life under the illusion of control, believing that everything around him remained exactly as it had always been, the truth was far more dangerous. The woman he had underestimated, ignored, and ultimately dismissed, had already begun taking everything from him. Quietly. Carefully. Completely. And by the time he realized it, there would be nothing left to save. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It doesn't collapse in a single dramatic moment, doesn't shatter loudly in a way that demands immediate attention. Instead, it fades in pieces, subtle enough to ignore at first, quiet enough to dismiss, until one day you look around and realize that what you thought was stable has already begun to unravel. For Ronan Vex, that realization did not come as a shock, not at the beginning. It arrived as something smaller, something almost insignificant, the kind of inconvenience a man like him had learned to brush aside without a second thought. The morning Iris left, he didn't notice anything unusual. The house was quiet, but it had always been quiet. Iris had never been the kind of woman who filled space with noise, never demanded attention, never disrupted the rhythm of his life. Her absence did not feel like absence at first. It felt like normality. Ronan moved through his routine with the same confidence he carried into everything, adjusting his cufflinks, checking his phone, responding to messages that required his attention. At one point, he called her name, not out of concern, but out of habit, a brief acknowledgement of her existence in a space he assumed she still occupied. Iris. No answer. He didn't call again. Because in his mind, there was no reason to. She would be there later. She always was. That was the first mistake. The first crack in something he didn't yet realize was already breaking. The call from his financial officer came that afternoon, and even then, it didn't register as a problem. There's been a delay, the man said carefully, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that Ronan immediately found irritating. Delays were not something he tolerated, not because they were impossible, but because they were avoidable. In what? Ronan asked, his tone calm but edged with impatience. A transfer. One of the accounts didn't process correctly. Ronan leaned back slightly, exhaling as if the conversation had already become a waste of his time. Then fix it. Yes, sir. We're looking into it. That was the end of it, as far as he was concerned. Problems like that resolved themselves. They always had. His world was built on efficiency, on control, on the understanding that anything that went wrong would be corrected quickly, quietly, without requiring his direct involvement. Or at least, that's what he believed. The second call came the next day, and this time, there was something different in the tone. Not just uncertainty, but confusion. Sir, we're having trouble accessing one of the subsidiary accounts. Ronan's expression tightened slightly, just enough to suggest that this was no longer an inconvenience, but not enough to indicate concern. What kind of trouble? It's been closed. That made him pause. Not long. But long enough. Closed by who? There was a silence on the other end of the line, the kind that suggested the answer was not going to be simple. By authorization. Ronan sat up straighter now, his attention fully engaged for the first time. Whose authorization? Another pause, longer this time, heavier. Yours, sir. The room seemed to still for a fraction of a second, the words settling into something that did not make sense, something that did not align with his understanding of reality. I didn't authorize anything, he said slowly, his voice controlled, but colder now. Yes, sir. That's what we thought. But the documentation is complete. Signed. Verified. Perfect. That was the word that lingered, the one detail that shifted this from a mistake into something else entirely. Mistakes left traces. Imperfections. This did not. Send me everything, Ronan said. The call ended, but this time, he didn't move on. This time, he remained where he was, his mind already beginning to work through possibilities, none of which felt entirely comfortable. Still, it wasn't enough to cause alarm. Not yet. By the third day, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. 2 more accounts inaccessible. A shipment delayed indefinitely. A partner who had always been reliable suddenly unreachable. Individually, each issue could have been explained, justified, resolved. Together, they formed something far more concerning. A pattern. And patterns, Ronan knew, were never accidental. He stood in his office, the city stretching out beneath him, his reflection faintly visible in the glass as he processed what was happening. "Find her," he said finally, his voice low but firm. There was no need to clarify who he meant. "She's not answering any calls," one of his men replied. "Then go to the house." "She's not there." A pause. "Anywhere?" "No, sir." That was the moment something shifted, not externally, not visibly, but internally, in a way that was subtle and undeniable. Because Iris did not simply leave. She did not disappear without reason. She did not break routine without cause. And suddenly, for the first time, Ronan considered a possibility he had never entertained before. This was not coincidence. This was not inconvenience. This was deliberate. The call that came later that night confirmed it, though not in the way he expected. "Ronan," the voice said, older, steady, carrying a weight that demanded attention. "Uncle Victor," Ronan replied, his tone respectful, but guarded now. "You've made a mistake." Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture shifting as the words settled. "I don't know what you're referring to." A soft exhale came from the other end, not quite a sigh, but close enough to suggest disappointment. "That's the problem." Silence followed, brief but significant, because whatever this was, it was not something that could be dismissed easily. "Do you know who your wife is?" Victor asked. Ronan frowned slightly, irritation flickering beneath the surface. "Of course I do." "No," Victor said quietly. "You don't." The words landed harder than they should have, not because of their content, but because of the certainty behind them. "Then tell me," Ronan said, his voice colder now, sharper. There was a pause, long enough to feel intentional, as if Victor was giving him time to consider what he was about to hear. "She's Darius Vale's daughter." Everything stopped. Not the world. Not the city. Just him. Because that name did not belong in casual conversation. It did not belong in association with something he thought he understood. Darius Vale. A man whose influence existed beyond visible power, beyond territory, beyond the structures Ronan had spent years building. A man who did not need to prove anything, because his presence alone was enough to define the boundaries others did not dare cross. And suddenly, everything made sense. The precision. The silence. The perfection. This was not chaos. This was design. "I didn't know," Ronan said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual confidence. "I know," Victor replied. For the first time in years, there was no certainty in his expression, no sense of control or superiority. There was only realization. He had not been in control. Not for a while. And what he didn't know, what he had never even considered, was that the moment Iris walked out of that house, she had already taken everything with her. The following days confirmed it in ways that could not be ignored. Government inspections appeared without warning, targeting businesses that had always operated just beyond the reach of scrutiny. Financial institutions began asking questions they had never asked before. Partners distanced themselves, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to create instability, enough to suggest that something had shifted beyond Ronan's influence. His empire did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled. Quietly. Efficiently. Inevitably. And then, finally, the call came. Not from a partner. Not from an associate. From her. "Iris," he said, the name sounding different now, heavier. A brief silence, and then her voice, calm, composed, exactly as it had always been, and yet entirely unfamiliar. "Hello, Ronan." He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. "You've made your point. What do you want?" There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. "Nothing," she replied. That answer unsettled him more than anything else. You destroyed everything. No, Iris said softly. I removed what shouldn't have been there. His jaw tightened. You could have just left. I did. Another pause. You didn't have to do this. This time, her voice changed slightly, not in tone, not in volume, but in something deeper, something that carried truth without emotion. You're right, she said. I didn't have to. A beat of silence. But you gave me a reason to. Ronan exhaled, something almost like frustration breaking through for the first time. It was nothing, he said. A distraction. I was bored. And that was it. That was the moment everything ended. Because what he didn't hear, what he couldn't possibly understand in that second, was the final door closing, not physically, not audibly, but completely. Inside her. Goodbye, Ronan. The line went dead. And just like that, he was alone. But what he didn't know was, this wasn't the end of it. Because some consequences require a final confrontation. And Iris Vex was not finished yet. There is a dangerous kind of confidence that only comes from habit, the belief that no matter how bad things look, no matter how unstable the situation becomes, there will always be a way back, always a path to regain what was lost. Ronan Vex had lived his entire life inside that belief. Power, to him, was not something fragile. It was something that could bend, adjust, disappear for a moment and then return stronger than before. He had built too much, controlled too much, influenced too many people to truly fall. Or at least, that was what he kept telling himself in the days that followed. Because after the shock settled, after the first wave of realization passed, something else took its place. Refusal. Refusal to accept that this was permanent. Refusal to believe that Iris had already moved beyond his reach. Refusal to see this as anything more than a temporary disruption that could still be corrected. And so, he did what men like him always do when they feel control slipping. He tried to take it back. The first attempt was quiet, almost instinctive. He reached out to the people he trusted most, the ones who had stood beside him for years, men who had built their loyalty not just on money, but on shared success. Calls were made, meetings arranged, reassurances given. Ronan spoke the way he always had, with confidence, with authority, as if nothing had truly changed, as if the ground beneath him was still solid. But something was different. Subtle. Almost invisible. And yet impossible to ignore once you noticed it. The responses were slower. The tone more careful. The certainty that once defined every interaction was replaced with hesitation, with pauses that lasted just a second too long. No one refused him outright. No one challenged him. But no one committed the way they used to. Because loyalty, when faced with uncertainty, begins to shift. And uncertainty was exactly what Iris had created. The second attempt was more direct. Ronan began tracing the damage, following the threads back to their source, looking for the point where things had started to go wrong. But that was the problem. There was no single point, no clear beginning, no obvious mistake he could isolate and fix. Everything had been done too cleanly, too precisely. The accounts that had been closed were legally authorized. The transfers that had gone through were documented, verified, impossible to reverse without raising questions he could not afford to answer. It wasn't sabotage in the way he understood it. It was restructuring. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else. Because sabotage is chaotic. But this was controlled. Deliberate. Intelligent. For the first time, Ronan was not reacting to a problem. He was reacting to a plan. And he was already behind. Days passed, and the pressure did not ease. If anything, it intensified, building slowly but steadily, like something tightening around him with no intention of letting go. Government inspections continued, targeting specific locations, specific operations, each one carefully chosen to cause maximum disruption without appearing coordinated. Financial institutions grew less cooperative, their tone shifting from respectful to cautious, their willingness to overlook certain irregularities suddenly replaced with strict adherence to policy. Someone had changed the rules. And Ronan knew exactly who. What he didn't understand was how far it went. The call from Victor came again, later than expected, as if the man had been waiting, observing, allowing things to unfold just enough before stepping in once more. "You're trying to fix it," Victor said, his voice calm, almost conversational. Ronan didn't bother denying it. "I built this," he replied. "I can rebuild it." A brief silence followed, and then something that sounded dangerously close to disappointment. "No," Victor said quietly. "You can't." Ronan's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "You underestimate me." "No," Victor replied. "You underestimated her." That sentence lingered longer than it should have, cutting through whatever confidence Ronan had been holding on to. "This doesn't end like this," he said, his voice colder now, more controlled. "It already has," Victor answered. The line went dead. And for the first time since this began, Ronan felt something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Not anger. Not frustration. But something far more unfamiliar. Uncertainty. He stood there for a long moment, the silence around him heavier than before, his mind moving through possibilities that no longer felt as solid as they once had. Because Victor was not a man who spoke without reason. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. If he said it was over, then it was. But Ronan was not ready to accept that. Not yet. Because there was still one thing he had not done. One thing he had not fully understood. He had not faced her. The realization came slowly, settling into place with a clarity that felt almost inevitable. Everything that had happened, every move that had been made, every piece that had been removed from his control, it all led back to one person. Iris. And until he understood her, until he saw her again, he would never truly understand what he was dealing with. The decision formed without hesitation. Find her. Not through his usual channels, not through the people who had already begun to distance themselves, but directly, personally, in a way that bypassed everything she had already dismantled. Because if there was one thing Ronan still believed, one thing he refused to let go of, it was this. No matter what she had done, she would meet him. She would want to see the result. She would want closure. What he didn't realize was that Iris Vex had already moved far beyond that. Far beyond closure. Far beyond anything he still believed he could control. Across the city, in a place far removed from the world Ronan had built, Iris stood by a window, the soft light of late afternoon stretching across the room, her expression calm, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested something had finally settled within her. The chaos she had set in motion continued without her, unfolding exactly as she had planned. Each piece, she turned slightly as the door opened, her gaze meeting his without surprise, without hesitation. Adrian Cade. 8 years. That was how long he had waited. Not actively. Not obviously. But consistently. While she lived a life that was never truly hers, while she played a role she never chose, he remained exactly where he had always been, outside of it, untouched by the decisions she had made for reasons that no longer mattered. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. Adrian stepped inside, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying something deeper, something that had not changed despite the time that had passed. "You're right on time," he replied. A faint pause settled between them, not uncomfortable, but filled with the weight of things that had never been said, things that had never needed to be said. "It's done," Iris said. Adrian studied her for a moment, not asking for details, not questioning the statement, because he already understood what it meant. "Completely?" he asked. "Yes." There was no hesitation in her answer. No doubt. And something in his expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "Then what happens now?" he asked. Iris turned her gaze back toward the window, the city stretching out before her, familiar and distant at the same time. For a long time, her life had been defined by what she had to do, by decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with her own desires. But now, for the first time, that was no longer true. Now, she said softly, I choose. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything else she had done. Because this was not about ending something. This was about beginning. And somewhere, in a penthouse that no longer felt like his, Ronan Vex was about to realize something that would change everything he thought he knew. This was not a situation he could recover from. This was not a game he could win. And the woman he thought he understood was never the woman he was married to. She was something else entirely. Something he had only just begun to see. And by the time he did, it would already be too late. There comes a point in every collapse when denial stops working, when the mind can no longer twist reality into something more comfortable, when the quiet voice that once whispered, "This can still be fixed," finally goes silent. For Ronan Vex, that moment did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in details too precise to ignore, in patterns too deliberate to dismiss, until eventually the truth stood in front of him so clearly that even he could not look away. At first, he tried to move faster, to act before the damage could spread further, convincing himself that speed would compensate for whatever advantage he had lost. Meetings were called, emergency decisions were made, instructions were given with a sharpness that bordered on desperation, though he would never admit that word applied to him. But speed, he began to realize, only made things worse. Every move he made revealed another problem, another inconsistency, another piece of a structure that no longer responded the way it used to. It was like trying to repair a machine while it was being dismantled from the inside, every adjustment triggering another failure somewhere else. The financial reports no longer aligned with reality. Numbers that should have been stable were shifting, not dramatically, not enough to trigger immediate alarm, but just enough to create doubt, just enough to suggest that something fundamental had changed. Transactions that had always moved smoothly now required verification, approval, scrutiny from institutions that had once operated without question. It wasn't just disruption, it was exposure. And exposure, in Ronan's world, was dangerous. He stood in his office late one evening, the city lights reflecting against the glass behind him, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened to yet another explanation that no longer satisfied him. "That's not possible," he said, his voice low but edged with something sharper now. "We've worked with them for years." "I understand that, sir," the voice on the other end replied carefully, "but they've changed their position. They're reviewing all previous agreements." "On what basis?" A pause. "Compliance." The word felt like a quiet threat. Ronan ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly as his reflection stared back at him, darker now, less certain. Compliance meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant attention. And attention was exactly what he had spent years avoiding. Someone had shifted the focus onto him. Someone had made sure the system he relied on would no longer protect him. And there was only one person capable of doing it this precisely. Iris. The realization was no longer distant, no longer abstract. It was immediate, unavoidable, woven into every problem he faced. She wasn't just behind this. She was controlling it. And that was when something changed inside him, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, in the way he began to think, the way he began to understand the situation he was in. Because for the first time, he stopped viewing this as a disruption. And started seeing it for what it really was. A dismantling. He poured himself a drink, though he didn't taste it when he took a sip, his mind too occupied, too focused on the pattern that had now become undeniable. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't reacted. She had planned, calculated, executed everything with a level of patience that he had never associated with her, not because it wasn't there, but because he had never taken the time to look for it. "I underestimated you," he said quietly to his own reflection, the admission sounding strange, unfamiliar, but undeniably true. And the worst part was, it wasn't just about her intelligence. It was about her restraint. Because anyone could act out of anger. But what she had done required control. Across the city, far removed from the pressure and tension that now defined Ronan's world, Iris sat in a quiet room filled with natural light, a file open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. Her gaze rested somewhere beyond the page, her thoughts moving through the next steps with the same calm precision that had guided everything she had done so far. There was no urgency in her movements, no sense of rushing toward an end, because she understood something Ronan was only beginning to grasp. This was already finished. What remained was simply the aftermath. "You're not watching it," Adrian said from across the room, his tone more observational than questioning. Iris shifted her gaze slightly, acknowledging his presence without fully turning toward him. "There's nothing to watch," she replied. "That's not entirely true," he said, leaning back slightly, studying her with the same quiet attentiveness he had always carried. "Most people would want to see the result. Most people act on emotion," Iris said. "And you don't?" A small pause followed, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer itself was simple. "I decide first," she said. "Emotion comes later. If it comes at all." Adrian nodded once, as if that confirmed something he already knew. "And now?" Iris closed the file gently, her fingers resting on the cover for a brief moment before she spoke again. "Now I make sure there's nothing left to rebuild." The words were calm, almost soft, but they carried a finality that left no room for interpretation. This wasn't about weakening Ronan. It wasn't about humiliating him or forcing him to understand what he had done. It was about ensuring that what he had built could not exist again. Back in the penthouse, Ronan reached the same conclusion, though from the opposite direction. The more he tried to stabilize things, the clearer it became that stabilization was no longer possible. Every solution led to another problem, every attempt to regain control exposed another area where control had already been lost. It wasn't just slipping away. It was gone. And the worst part was, he didn't know when it had happened. That realization stayed with him longer than anything else, settling into a quiet space in his mind that refused to be ignored. Because if he couldn't identify the moment he lost control, then he had to accept something far more unsettling. He had never truly had it. The thought lingered as he moved through the empty penthouse, the silence heavier now, no longer familiar, no longer neutral. It felt different. Not peaceful, but hollow. He stopped in the doorway of her old room, his gaze moving across the space slowly, taking in the absence of anything that belonged to her. She hadn't taken much. Not the expensive things, not the items he had given her, not even the pieces that might have held sentimental value. She had taken only what mattered. And left everything else behind. "That's enough." The memory of her voice surfaced unexpectedly, quiet but clear, the same words she had spoken in the cafe, though he had not been there to hear them. And yet somehow, he could imagine it now, the tone, the calm certainty behind it, the absence of hesitation. It wasn't anger that drove her. It was decision. And that was what made this impossible to fight. His phone vibrated in his hand, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening slightly as he saw the message. A location. No name. No explanation. But he knew exactly who it was from. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply stared at it, the weight of everything that had happened settling into that single point, that single choice. This was it. Not the end of the situation. But the moment he would finally face it. Finally face her. He grabbed his coat without hesitation, his movements precise, controlled, though there was something different beneath the surface now, something less certain, less confident. Because this time, he wasn't walking into a meeting he controlled. He was walking into something else entirely. Across the city, Iris stood by the window once more, her phone resting in her hand, the message already sent, her expression unchanged. This was the final step, not because anything remained unresolved, but because some things required acknowledgement, a final moment where everything that had been left unsaid could exist, if only briefly. "Are you sure about this?" Adrian asked quietly. Iris didn't turn. "Yes." There was no hesitation. No doubt. And that was enough. Because this meeting was not about closure. It was not about understanding. It was about consequence. And Ronan Vex was about to come face to face with something he had never truly encountered before. Not power. Not control. But the result of underestimating someone who had nothing left to lose. The city moved around them, unaware, unchanged, as if this moment held no significance at all. But for the two people about to meet, everything had already shifted beyond recognition. Because once this conversation ended, there would be no illusion left. No denial. No possibility of going back. Only truth. And the truth, as Ronan was about to learn, was far more unforgiving than anything he had ever faced before. There are meetings that are planned, calculated down to the smallest detail, where every word is rehearsed and every outcome anticipated. And then there are meetings that exist beyond control, where no preparation is enough, where the outcome has already been decided long before either person arrives. As Ronan Vex stepped out of the car that night, he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that this was the second kind. The location was not grand, not symbolic, not even particularly memorable, a quiet rooftop overlooking the city, far removed from the polished spaces where men like him usually conducted business. There were no guards, no visible security, no signs of anything that would suggest importance. And yet, as he made his way toward the edge where a single figure stood, still and composed against the backdrop of distant lights, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel before. Not fear. But awareness. Because this was not his ground. And the woman waiting for him was not the one he had left behind. Iris. Her name left his mouth more quietly than he expected, as if the space itself demanded restraint. She didn't turn immediately, her gaze still fixed on the city below, as if what she was looking at mattered more than his arrival. For a moment, the silence stretched, not awkward, not tense, but deliberate, like a pause placed exactly where it needed to be. "You're late," she said finally, her voice calm, unchanged. Ronan frowned slightly. "I came as soon as I got the message." "And yet," she replied softly, "you're still late." The words carried meaning beyond time, and he understood it instantly. He had been late in seeing her, late in understanding, late in realizing what he was dealing with. And now, no matter how quickly he moved, he would always be behind. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since everything had fallen apart. There was no anger in her expression, no visible trace of what he had done, no sign of the moment that had set all of this in motion. If anything, she looked lighter. As if something had been removed rather than broken. Ronan studied her carefully, searching for something familiar, something he could hold on to, but there was nothing. "You've changed," he said. Iris tilted her head slightly. "No," she replied. "You're just seeing me now." That answer settled between them, quiet but undeniable, leaving no space for argument. Ronan exhaled slowly, taking a step closer, though not too close, not enough to cross a boundary he couldn't yet define. "You've made your point," he said, his tone controlled, measured, as if he were still trying to approach this like a negotiation. "You've taken everything. The businesses, the accounts, the people. There's nothing left." Iris didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched him for a moment, as if evaluating something, confirming something, before speaking. "Not everything," she said. Ronan's brow tightened slightly. "Then what's left?" She held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "You." The word landed heavier than anything else she could have said. Not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't. It wasn't a promise of destruction. It was something else entirely. A statement. Ronan let out a quiet breath, something between disbelief and realization. "So that's it?" he asked. "You leave me with nothing, and expect me to just exist?" Iris took a small step forward now, closing part of the distance between them, though her presence remained composed, controlled. "No," she said softly. "I expect you to understand." "Understand what?" His voice sharpened slightly, not in anger, but in frustration, in the need to grasp something that still felt just out of reach. "That actions have weight, she replied. That choices have consequences. And that not everything can be undone. Ronan shook his head slightly, a faint, humorless smile crossing his lips. You think I don't know that? I think, Iris said, her tone even, you never had to face it. Silence followed, heavier now, filled with everything that had led them here. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to the moment, unaware of the shift that had already taken place. I could rebuild, Ronan said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less certain. It wouldn't be the same, but... You won't, Iris interrupted gently. The certainty in her voice stopped him. Not because it was loud, but because it was absolute. And you know that, she added. Ronan didn't respond immediately. He didn't argue, didn't push back, because somewhere, beneath everything else, he understood she was right. Not because he lacked the ability, but because the foundation he had relied on no longer existed. The system had turned against him. The people had stepped away. The structure had been removed so completely that rebuilding it would mean starting from nothing, and men like him were not built for that. You planned all of this, he said finally, his gaze fixed on her. Long before that night. Iris considered the question for a brief moment, not because she needed to think about the answer, but because she understood what he was really asking. When I saw you, she said slowly, I made a decision. That's not what I asked. No, she agreed softly. But it's the answer. Another pause settled between them, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like understanding, as if something had finally aligned, even if it was too late to change anything. Ronan looked at her for a long moment, his expression shifting in a way that was subtle but undeniable. I was bored, he said quietly, the words sounding different now, stripped of their arrogance, their carelessness. I know, Iris replied. There was no judgment in her voice. No anger. Just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made it worse. Do you hate me? He asked, the question coming out before he could stop it, unexpected, unplanned. Iris was silent for a moment, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. Then she shook her head slightly. No. The answer was simple. And final. Then what is this? Ronan asked, his voice lower now, almost searching. Iris met his eyes, her own calm, clear, unwavering. This, she said softly, is the result. The words settled into place with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't about emotion. It wasn't about revenge or anger. Ronan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, not because the situation had improved, but because he had finally stopped fighting it. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control the conversation, wasn't trying to steer it in a direction that benefited him. He was simply there. I never asked who you were, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more reflective. No, Iris replied. I never looked. No. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, not out of amusement, but out of something else, something closer to understanding. But you will, she said. Ronan frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, Iris said, stepping back slightly, creating distance once more, you'll spend the rest of your life thinking about it. The statement lingered, heavier than anything else she had said, not because it was threatening, but because it was true. Some questions don't need answers to stay with you. Some realizations don't fade with time. They stay. And they change you. Iris turned then, her gaze shifting away from him, back toward the city, as if the conversation had already ended in her mind. This is the last time we speak, she said. Ronan didn't move. Didn't stop her. Because he knew. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to fix. Nothing left to hold on to. And as she walked away, her step steady, unhurried, her figure slowly disappearing into the quiet darkness of the rooftop, Ronan Vex stood there alone, surrounded by a city that no longer belonged to him, carrying a realization that would follow him long after this moment had passed. He hadn't lost to chaos. He hadn't fallen because of bad luck. He had been undone. By someone he never thought to understand. And what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see yet, was that this ending was only the beginning of something else. Because while one life had just collapsed completely, another was finally about to begin. Some endings don't feel like endings at all. They don't come with relief or celebration, don't arrive with a sense of victory or closure. Instead, they leave behind something quieter, something more unfamiliar, a space where something used to exist, now empty, waiting to be filled with something new. For Iris, that space did not feel frightening. It felt open. And for the first time in years, she didn't rush to define it. The night she walked away from Ronan on that rooftop, she didn't look back. Not because she was forcing herself forward, not because she was trying to be strong, but because there was simply nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. Whatever that chapter had been, whatever it had meant or cost, it had already been resolved long before that final conversation. What remained now was not an ending, but a transition, a quiet shift from one life into another. The city felt different as she stepped into the street below, not quieter, not calmer, but clearer somehow, as if the noise no longer reached her in the same way. For 3 years, she had existed within a structure built by someone else, moving according to expectations that were never truly hers. Now, without that structure, without those expectations, she found herself standing in something she had not experienced in a long time. Choice. Not the illusion of it, not the carefully managed version that allowed limited freedom within defined boundaries, but something real, something absolute. And the weight of it did not overwhelm her. It grounded her. You didn't stay long. Adrian's voice came from just behind her, steady as always, carrying that same quiet presence that had never demanded attention, never forced itself into her space, but had always been there when she chose to acknowledge it. Iris turned slightly, meeting his gaze without surprise, as if she had known he would follow, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding. There was nothing to stay for, she replied. Adrian studied her for a moment, not searching for cracks, not expecting emotion she had never shown, but simply observing the subtle difference that now existed beneath the surface. And now, he asked. Iris glanced briefly toward the city before looking back at him. Now I decide what comes next. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty in her expression. But there was something else, something softer, something that had not been present before, not weakness, not vulnerability, but possibility. Adrian nodded once, as if that answer was enough, as if he didn't need to ask anything more. Because he understood something that most people didn't, that Iris was not someone who needed guidance, not someone who required reassurance or direction. She only needed space. And now, she finally had it. The days that followed did not unfold dramatically. There were no sudden changes, no visible shifts that marked the beginning of a new life. Instead, everything moved gradually, almost quietly, as if the world itself was adjusting to her in a different way. Iris relocated to a smaller place, far removed from the excess and control of the life she had left behind. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't a retreat. It was intentional. Every choice she made now was. The mornings were different. Slower. Not because she lacked purpose, but because she was no longer operating within someone else's timeline. She woke when she chose, moved through her day without the constant awareness of expectation, without the need to anticipate someone else's decisions. And in that space, something began to shift within her, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like something long dormant beginning to surface. Adrian remained part of that space, not as an interruption, not as a replacement for anything she had lost, but as something separate entirely. He didn't push, didn't demand her attention, didn't ask for answers she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he existed alongside her, steady and patient, allowing things to unfold in their own time. You're still watching everything, he said one evening, his voice carrying a quiet observation rather than a question as he leaned against the doorway, his gaze resting on her. Iris didn't look up immediately, her attention still focused on the documents in front of her, though her mind had already processed what he meant. Habit, she replied. Or control? She paused then, just briefly, before closing the file and lifting her gaze. Awareness, she corrected. Adrian considered that for a moment, then nodded. And when does it stop? Iris held his gaze, her expression calm, thoughtful. When it's no longer necessary. And is it still necessary? That question lingered, not because it was difficult, but because it required honesty. For a long time, awareness had been a form of control, a way to anticipate, to prepare, to protect. But now, things were different. No, she said finally. The word was simple, but it carried something more, a quiet release, an acknowledgement that she no longer needed to operate in the same way, no longer needed to anticipate threats that no longer existed. And with that realization, something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. The tension she had carried, the constant awareness, the quiet readiness for something to go wrong, it began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar, something lighter, something she had not allowed herself to feel before. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, not the temporary kind that disappears at the first sign of disruption, but something deeper, something rooted in certainty, in the knowledge that she was no longer bound to anything she did not choose. And for Iris, that was enough. Time moved forward, as it always does, carrying with it changes that felt both subtle and significant. The world Ronan had once controlled no longer reached her, no longer intersected with her life in any meaningful way. Whatever remained of his empire existed somewhere distant, irrelevant, disconnected from everything she had built for herself. She didn't check. Didn't ask. Didn't need to know. Because that part of her life had ended completely. And she had no intention of revisiting it. Instead, her focus shifted towards something else, something she had not allowed herself to consider before, not strategy, not control, not consequence, but something far more personal. Connection. Real, unstructured, unforced. And slowly, without urgency, without pressure, she allowed it. Adrian didn't rush it. He didn't treat her like something fragile, didn't approach her with caution or hesitation. He simply remained consistent, steady in a way that did not demand anything in return. And over time, that consistency became something she could rely on, not because she needed it, but because she chose to. "You're different," he said one evening, the two of them standing by the window as the city settled into night. Iris glanced at him briefly, a faint hint of curiosity in her gaze. "In what way?" Adrian smiled slightly, not broadly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest something genuine. "You stay," he said. She considered that for a moment, the words settling into place, carrying more meaning than they appeared to on the surface. For a long time, she had existed in a state of constant readiness, always prepared to leave, always aware of the possibility that nothing around her was permanent. But now, she wasn't preparing for departure. She was choosing presence. "I do," she said softly. And for the first time, the words didn't feel temporary. They felt real. But what Iris didn't know, what she hadn't allowed herself to consider yet, was that even after everything she had ended, everything she had left behind, some consequences don't disappear so easily. Some things linger. Not as threats, but as unfinished echoes. And far away, in a life that no longer resembled what it once was, Ronan Vex was beginning to understand something he had never faced before. Not loss, but emptiness. And that realization was only just beginning. There is a difference between losing something and realizing it's never coming back. One is sharp, immediate, almost easier to process because it gives you something to react to. The other is slow. It settles in gradually, filling the spaces where certainty used to exist, until one day you wake up and understand that what's gone is gone permanently. For Ronan Vex, that understanding did not arrive all at once. It came in the quiet. At first, he filled that quiet with movement. Calls, meetings, attempts to reconnect with people who had once answered him without hesitation. He adjusted, recalculated, tried to rebuild in smaller ways, convincing himself that if he could just stabilize one part of his world, the rest would follow. But the truth was far less forgiving. The calls were returned less frequently. The meetings ended without commitment. The doors that had always been open were now closed, not forcefully, not dramatically, but with a polite distance that made it impossible to push. Because no one wanted to be connected to what he had become. Not publicly. Not privately. And certainly not permanently. The penthouse, once a symbol of control and presence, now felt like something else entirely. Too large. Too empty. Too quiet. The silence inside it was different now. It wasn't the controlled, composed silence that had defined his life before. It was hollow, echoing in a way that made every step feel louder than it should, every movement more noticeable. Ronan stood in the center of the room one evening, his gaze drifting across the space slowly, as if expecting something to change, as if waiting for the familiar rhythm of his life to return. But nothing did. The city outside continued as it always had, lights flickering in the distance, people moving through their own lives without pause, without awareness of what had shifted in his. For the first time, he understood something he had never needed to understand before. The world does not stop when you fall. It continues. Without you. He moved toward the window, his reflection staring back at him once again, but this time it looked different. Not weaker. Not broken. But stripped. Stripped of the certainty he had always carried, stripped of the quiet arrogance that had once defined him. What remained was something simpler. A man. Nothing more. And that, more than anything else, unsettled him. His phone sat untouched on the table behind him, no longer vibrating with constant updates, no longer demanding his attention. The silence of it felt heavier than any conversation ever had. Because in his world, silence had always meant something was wrong. Now, it meant nothing was left. He picked it up slowly, scrolling through contacts that once represented power, influence, opportunity. Names that had mattered. Names that had responded. Names that now felt distant, irrelevant, disconnected from who he was becoming. He stopped at one. Iris. For a long moment, he stared at it, his thumb hovering over the screen, not because he expected an answer, not because he believed it would change anything, but because the act itself carried weight. Calling her now would mean something different. It would not be control. It would not be demand. It would be acknowledgement. And for a man like Ronan, that was not easy. He lowered the phone slowly, setting it back down without making the call. Because somewhere, beneath everything else, he understood. There was nothing left to say. Across the city, in a space that felt entirely separate from everything Ronan had lost, Iris moved through her life with a quiet steadiness that had nothing to do with the past she had left behind. The absence of chaos did not feel strange to her. It felt natural. As if this was how things had always been meant to be, and everything before had simply been a deviation she had corrected. The mornings came gently, without urgency, without expectation. She woke to light instead of obligation, to stillness instead of anticipation. And in that stillness, she found something she had not realized she was missing. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from understanding a situation, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to. Adrian watched her from across the room one morning, his expression thoughtful, observant in the way it had always been. "You don't look back," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Iris glanced at him briefly, her movements unhurried as she set her cup down. "There's nothing there," she replied. "Most people would still check," he said. "Most people didn't leave completely." The answer was simple, but it carried something deeper, a finality that left no space for doubt. She had not just walked away. She had removed herself entirely, not just from the physical space, but from everything that connected her to it. "And if something from that life comes back?" Adrian asked. Iris met his gaze, calm, steady, unshaken. "Then it will be dealt with." No hesitation. No concern. Just certainty. Adrian nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing further. Because he understood something that Ronan had not, when Iris made a decision, it was not temporary. It was not conditional. It was absolute. Time moved forward, and with it came changes that felt both subtle and significant. The connection between them deepened, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through consistency, through the quiet presence of something that did not demand, did not control, did not require anything beyond what was freely given. "You're staying again," Adrian said one evening, a faint hint of something softer in his tone. Iris looked at him, a small pause settling between them before she responded. "I am." And this time, the words carried something more. Not just choice, but intention. But what neither of them realized, what neither of them could see yet, was that some stories do not end cleanly. Some consequences take longer to surface. And far away, in a life that had been stripped down to its most basic form, Ronan Vex was beginning to change. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But in small, quiet ways that even he did not fully understand yet. Because losing everything forces you to see things differently. To think differently. To become something else entirely. And what he was becoming was no longer the man Iris had left behind. But what he didn't know was that his story was not finished either. Change does not always arrive with intention. Sometimes it begins in silence, in the absence of everything that once defined you, in the slow realization that the person you were no longer fits the life you're living. For Ronan Vex, that realization did not come as a decision. It came as a consequence. The days had become quieter. Not just around him, but within him. The urgency that once drove every action, every conversation, every move he made had faded, replaced by something slower, more deliberate. At first, he resisted it. He tried to fill the space with movement, with purpose, with anything that resembled the life he used to control. But without the structure that supported that life, everything felt forced, unnatural, disconnected. So eventually, he stopped trying. And that was when things began to shift. The penthouse was gone. Not taken, not seized, but left behind. It no longer made sense to remain there, surrounded by something that no longer belonged to him. The space had become a reminder rather than a refuge, and Ronan was not a man who lived in reminders. Now, the place he occupied was smaller. Simpler. There were no excess details, no unnecessary displays of wealth or control. Just space. Just quiet. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Then, it felt honest. He stood by the window one morning, watching the city from a different angle, a lower view, closer to the movement, closer to the noise. The distance he once maintained was gone, replaced by something more immediate, more real. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rise above it. He simply observed. And in that observation, something changed. Because without power, without influence, without the constant reinforcement of control, he was forced to see things differently, not as a man directing the world around him, but as someone existing within it. His phone rang. The sound was unfamiliar now, not because it was rare, but because it no longer carried the same weight. He glanced at the screen briefly before answering. Ronan. The voice was cautious. Measured. Not quite respectful. Victor, he replied. A pause followed, not long, but enough to suggest that this was not a casual call. I've been hearing things, Victor said. Ronan leaned slightly against the wall, his expression neutral. I'm sure you have. Another pause. You've stopped pushing, Victor continued. Yes. The simplicity of the answer seemed to catch the older man off guard. That doesn't sound like you. Ronan's gaze shifted toward the window again, the city moving steadily below. It isn't. Silence settled between them, but this time, it wasn't tense. It was thoughtful. And what does that mean? Victor asked. Ronan considered the question, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer itself was still forming. It means, he said slowly, I finally understand what I was doing. And what was that? A faint breath escaped him, something that might have been a quiet acknowledgement more than anything else. I was maintaining something that was already empty. The words hung in the air, heavier than expected, because they carried truth that had taken time to surface. Victor didn't respond immediately. Because he understood. Most men don't realize that, he said after a moment. Most men don't lose everything, Ronan replied. Another pause. And now? Ronan looked out at the city again, his expression calmer than it had been in a long time. Now I see what's left. The call ended shortly after, not because there was nothing more to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said. Ronan lowered the phone slowly, setting it aside without a second thought. Because for the first time, he wasn't waiting for the next call. Across the city, in a life that had grown steadily more grounded, more intentional, Iris moved through her day with the same quiet clarity that had defined her decisions from the beginning. But something had changed. Not in her actions. Not in her choices. But in the space she allowed herself to feel. The distance she once maintained from everything around her had softened, not completely, not in a way that made her vulnerable, but enough to allow something else to exist alongside her control. Adrian noticed it first. You're thinking about something, he said one afternoon, his tone calm, observational as always. Iris glanced at him briefly, not surprised by the comment. I always am. Yes, he agreed, but not like this. That made her pause. Not because she disagreed, but because she recognized what he meant. This is different, he added. A quiet moment passed before she responded. It's not about him, she said. Adrian nodded slightly. I didn't say it was. Iris leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting toward the window, mirroring a posture she had taken many times before, but now carrying a different weight. For a long time, she said slowly, everything I did had a reason tied to something else. A response. A calculation. A necessity. And now it doesn't? Adrian asked. She shook her head slightly. Now it's just a choice. The difference was subtle. But it changed everything. Because choice, when it is no longer influenced by pressure or expectation, becomes something pure. Something real. And how does that feel? Adrian asked quietly. Iris considered the question for a moment, not searching for the answer, but allowing it to form naturally. Unfamiliar, she said. A faint pause. But right. Adrian smiled slightly, not broadly, not dramatically, but enough to show that he understood exactly what she meant. And for a moment, nothing else needed to be said. Because sometimes, the absence of conflict is the clearest sign of peace. But what neither of them realized, what neither of them could see yet, was that peace, when it is new, is not always permanent. Not because it will be taken, but because it will be tested. And far away, in a life that was slowly rebuilding itself in a different form, Ronan Vex was about to face something he had not encountered before. Not loss. Not failure. But opportunity. Not the kind he once chased. But the kind that forces a man to decide who he is now. And what he is willing to become. Because sometimes, losing everything is the only way to see what truly matters. And what comes next will define everything. There are moments in a person's life that do not announce themselves as important. They don't arrive with warning, don't carry the dramatic weight of something clearly life-changing. Instead, they appear quietly, almost insignificantly, like any other moment. And yet, later, when everything has shifted, when the path has already been chosen, those are the moments you look back on and realize. That was where it began. For Ronan Vex, that moment came on a morning that felt no different from the ones before it. The city was already awake, moving with its usual rhythm, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place within a man who had once stood above it. He walked down a street he had never needed to walk before, past places he had never noticed, past people who had never existed in his world. There was no purpose in his steps, no destination that required urgency. And strangely, that didn't bother him. Not anymore. Because for the first time in years, he was not moving towards something he needed to control. He was simply moving. A small cafe sat on the corner, unremarkable in every way, the kind of place he would have ignored without a second thought in his previous life. But something about it made him stop, not curiosity, not intention, just a quiet instinct that didn't demand explanation. He stepped inside. The air was warm, filled with the low hum of conversation and the soft clinking of cups against porcelain. No one looked at him twice. No one recognized him. And for a moment, that anonymity felt unfamiliar. Then, it felt relieving. He ordered without thinking, his voice calm, his presence unnoticed, and when he sat down by the window, he realized something that would have once unsettled him. He had nowhere else to be. And for once, that was enough. Across the room, a conversation unfolded between two strangers, their voices low, their expressions animated, their focus entirely on something that mattered only to them. Ronan watched them briefly, not intruding, not analyzing, just observing. There was no strategy in it. No calculation. Just awareness. And in that moment, something shifted again. Because for the first time, he wasn't looking at people as pieces in a system, as variables to control or outcomes to predict. He was simply seeing them. The realization settled quietly, without resistance, without conflict. And with it came something else, something unfamiliar, something he had never allowed himself to experience before. Perspective. Not the kind that comes from power, but the kind that comes from absence of it. His phone remained in his pocket, silent, irrelevant. He didn't reach for it. Didn't check it. Didn't feel the need to fill the space with something else. Because the space itself was no longer uncomfortable. And that was new. Back across the city, in a life built not on necessity but on intention, Iris stood in a place that felt entirely her own, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The sunlight filtered through the windows, soft and steady, illuminating a space that had no connection to anything she had left behind. Adrian stood nearby, watching her in that same quiet way, as if he understood that some moments didn't need interruption. "You're not thinking about the past anymore," he said. Iris didn't turn immediately. She let the words settle, not because she needed to consider them, but because she recognized the truth in them. "No," she said softly. Not because she was uncertain, but because the question itself carried a different kind of weight now. For a long time, the future had been something she prepared for, something she controlled, something she shaped through careful decisions and calculated moves. But now it was something else. "It's not something I need to control anymore," she said. Adrian studied her for a moment, a faint hint of something thoughtful in his expression. "Then what is it?" Iris turned to face him fully now, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed in a way that would have been impossible not long ago. "It's something I get to experience." The words were simple, but they carried more meaning than anything else she had said. Because for the first time, her life was not a strategy. It was her own. Adrian smiled slightly, not in surprise, not in disbelief, but in quiet understanding. "That sounds like something worth staying for," he said. Iris held his gaze for a moment, a small pause settling between them, not uncertain, not hesitant, but meaningful. "It is," she replied. And this time, there was no question behind it. But somewhere, in a part of the city that no longer held power but still held memory, Ronan Vex sat in that quiet cafe, his coffee untouched, his gaze distant as he watched the world move in a way he had never truly seen before. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to change it. He didn't feel the need to shape it. He didn't feel the need to own it. He simply existed within it. And in that existence, something new began to take form. Not ambition. Not control. But something far less defined. And perhaps far more important. Understanding. Because when everything is taken away, what remains is not always loss. Sometimes, it's clarity. And what Ronan was beginning to see was not what he had lost, but what he had never had. And what he might still become. But what neither of them knew. What neither of them could possibly see yet. was that life does not end when the story feels complete. Because even after closure, even after peace, there are moments still waiting. Moments that test not who you were, but who you have chosen to be. And those moments were closer than either of them realized. Peace, when it first arrives, often feels permanent. It settles gently into the spaces once filled with tension, creating the illusion that nothing will disturb it again. But peace is not the absence of challenge. It is the presence of stability, until something tests it. And for Iris, that test did not come as chaos, not as something loud or destructive. It came quietly, almost invisibly, like a shadow passing across something steady. It began with something small. A name. Not spoken aloud. Not introduced directly. Just mentioned in passing, in a conversation that held no immediate significance. Iris was seated across from Adrian in a quiet restaurant, the kind of place where conversations blended together into a soft background hum, indistinct and easy to ignore. But her attention shifted the moment she heard it. Vex. The word was subtle, almost lost in the rhythm of voices around her. But it was enough. Her expression didn't change. Her posture remained composed. But something inside her paused, not out of fear, not out of concern, but out of recognition. Because names like that did not appear randomly, not in her world, not without reason. Adrian noticed the shift immediately. "You heard that," he said quietly. Iris didn't respond right away. She let the moment settle, let the conversation behind her continue, let the details surface naturally without forcing them. "Yes," she said finally. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly, not with alarm, but with focus. "Do you want to leave?" Iris shook her head once. "No." Because leaving would mean reacting. And she no longer reacted. She observed. The conversation continued behind them, fragmented, indistinct, but enough pieces emerged to form something recognizable. Not a threat. Not a plan. But a discussion. A quiet acknowledgement of something shifting in the city, something that had not yet reached the surface, but was moving beneath it. Someone stepping into the space. Vex left a vacuum. New structure forming. The words were enough. Not to alarm her, but to inform her. Because power does not disappear. It redistributes. And when it does, it rarely settles without resistance. Iris leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the table, her mind already processing the implications without urgency, without tension. "Someone is moving in," Adrian said. "Yes. And that affects you?" Iris met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. "No." The answer was immediate. And yet, not entirely complete. Because while it did not affect her directly, it touched something adjacent, something that had once been part of her life, something she had removed herself from completely. Or so she believed. Adrian studied her for a moment, not questioning the answer, but understanding the space around it. "You're thinking about it," he said. "I'm aware of it," she corrected. A small distinction. But an important one. Because awareness did not require involvement. And Iris had no intention of being pulled back into something she had already left behind. Still, the thought lingered. Not as concern, but as possibility. Across the city, Ronan Vex stood in a place that had nothing to do with the life he used to live, a quiet warehouse space, stripped of excess, stripped of meaning beyond its immediate function. It wasn't his. It wasn't part of anything he controlled. It was simply where he had been asked to come. And for reasons he did not fully understand. He had agreed. "You look different." The voice came from the shadows near the entrance, familiar enough to recognize, though not immediately place. Ronan turned slightly, his expression neutral as a man stepped into the light, his presence calm, measured, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than caution. "Do I?" Ronan replied. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "You're not carrying it anymore." Ronan frowned slightly. Carrying what? The man smiled faintly, not mockingly, but knowingly. Everything. A brief silence followed. Not tense. Not confrontational. Just observational. Ronan considered the statement, not dismissing it, not fully accepting it, but acknowledging that there was truth in it somewhere. I don't need to, he said finally. The man nodded again, as if that answer confirmed something. That makes you different. Ronan's gaze sharpened slightly. From what? From what you were. Another pause. And what I am now? Ronan asked. The man took a step closer, his expression steady. That depends on what you choose next. The words hung in the air, simple, direct, but carrying weight that Ronan could not ignore. Because choice, as he had begun to understand, was not something he had truly exercised before. Not freely. Not without influence. And why does that matter to you? Ronan asked. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted slightly, something that suggested purpose rather than curiosity. Because the space you left behind, he said slowly, is being filled. Ronan didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Because he already knew that. And, he asked. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him. And not everyone stepping into it understands what they're creating. A subtle implication. Not a threat. Not a request. Just information. Ronan let the words settle, his mind moving through them without urgency, without instinctive reaction. I'm not part of that anymore, he said. I know, the man replied. Then why am I here? Another faint smile. Because whether you like it or not, he said quietly, you still understand it better than anyone. Silence followed. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not externally. Not visibly. But internally. Because for the first time since everything had ended, Ronan was being pulled toward something. Not power. Not control. But relevance. And that was something he had not expected. Back at the restaurant, Iris rose from her seat, her movements calm, and as the city continued to move around them, unaware of the quiet shifts taking place beneath its surface, two paths that had once completely separated began, very subtly, to align again. Not directly. Not intentionally. But inevitably. Because some stories, no matter how complete they seem, have a way of circling back. And what neither Iris nor Ronan realized was that the peace they had both found was about to be tested. Not by the past, but by something new. Something neither of them had planned for. Something that would force them to decide, once again, who they are now, and what they are willing to protect. There are moments when the past doesn't return as a memory, but as a consequence. Not something that asks for attention, not something that demands recognition, but something that simply appears, already in motion, already unfolding, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. And for both Iris and Ronan, that moment had already begun, quietly, invisibly, long before either of them realized they were moving toward it. The city had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be obvious to anyone walking its streets or watching its skyline. But beneath the surface, in the spaces where influence shifted and power restructured itself, something new was taking form. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't disorder. It was ambition. Unrefined. Uncontrolled. And that made it dangerous. Iris felt it first not as a threat, but as a pattern that didn't align. She sat in her apartment late one evening, a file open in front of her, her attention drawn not to what was written, but to what was missing. The structure of movement in the city, the way certain operations flowed, the balance that had once existed even in its most controlled forms, it was no longer there. Not broken, but altered. Subtly. And incorrectly. You've been staring at the same page for 10 minutes, Adrian said from across the room, his voice quiet, observant. Iris didn't look up immediately. Because it doesn't make sense, she replied. Adrian leaned slightly forward, resting his arms against his knees, his attention fully on her now. What doesn't? She closed the file gently, her fingers resting on the edge as her gaze lifted to meet his. The way things are moving, she said. It's not structured. It's reactive. And that's a problem? Iris tilted her head slightly, considering how to explain something that, to her, was instinctive. It creates instability, she said. And instability spreads. Adrian studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You said it doesn't affect you. It doesn't, she replied. A pause. But it will affect everything around it. That distinction mattered. Because Iris had removed herself from that world. But she had not removed herself from the consequences it could create. And consequences, unlike control, do not respect boundaries. Across the city, Ronan stood in that same warehouse space, though this time it felt different, not because the place had changed, but because his understanding of it had. The man who had called him there was waiting again, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, as if he had expected Ronan to return. You came back, he said. Ronan didn't respond immediately. His gaze moved briefly across the space before settling on the man in front of him. I wanted to understand, he said. The man nodded once. That's a good reason. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It carried weight, purpose, something waiting to be addressed. This shift, Ronan continued. It's not organized. No, the man agreed. It's not stable. No. Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly. Then it won't last. The man smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. That depends. On what? On whether someone corrects it, or lets it collapse. The words lingered. Because Ronan understood both outcomes. Collapse meant chaos. Correction meant control. And control was something he had walked away from. I'm not interested in rebuilding what I had, Ronan said. I know, the man replied. Then why am I here? This time, the man stepped closer, his expression steady, his voice lower. Because this isn't about what you had, he said. It's about what's coming. Ronan held his gaze, unmoving. And what's coming? He asked. A brief pause. Just long enough to matter. Something worse. The answer was simple. But it carried a weight that Ronan could not ignore. Back in her apartment, Iris stood by the window, the city stretching out before her, familiar and distant all at once. Her mind moved through the patterns again, the inconsistencies, the shifts that did not align with anything she had previously known. And then it clicked. Not completely. But enough. They're not replacing the structure, she said quietly. Adrian looked at her. They're imitating it. The difference was critical. Because imitation, without understanding, leads to failure. And failure, in that world, leads to escalation. What happens when it fails? Adrian asked. Iris didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was obvious. It breaks, she said. And when it breaks? This time, her gaze hardened slightly, not with emotion, but with clarity. It takes everything with it. The room fell silent. Not because there was nothing left to say. But because everything had already been understood. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both processing what that meant, not for them directly, but for the city, for the balance that had once existed, for the fragile line that separated control from chaos. You're thinking about stepping in, Adrian said. Iris didn't deny it. I'm thinking about preventing a collapse, she corrected. And that requires involvement. A pause. Yes. Adrian stood slowly, moving closer, his gaze steady, his tone calm. You said you were done. I am, Iris replied. Then this isn't your responsibility. Another pause. Longer this time. Because this was the line. The one she had not intended to cross again. The one that separated her new life from the one she had left behind. I know, she said. And yet? Iris turned to face him fully, her expression composed, but something deeper moving beneath it. And yet. I understand it. That was the truth. And understanding carries weight. Responsibility, even when it is not chosen. Across the city, Ronan reached the same conclusion. Not because he wanted to. But because he couldn't ignore it. This will collapse, he said. Yes, the man replied. And when it does, it won't be contained. Silence settled again. And in that silence, something aligned. Not between them, but within them. Because both Iris and Ronan, in completely different places, in completely different lives, had arrived at the same realization. This wasn't about the past. This wasn't about what had been lost. This was about what could happen next. And whether they chose to ignore it. Or step in. But what neither of them knew was that the decision had already begun to form. Not as a plan. Not as a strategy. But as something simpler. A line. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning to what came before. Because some choices do not allow distance afterward. And the moment they both step forward, whether they intend to or not, everything will change. Again. There are decisions that feel like choices, and then there are decisions that feel inevitable. The kind that form quietly, beneath the surface, long before they are spoken aloud. The kind you recognize not as something you want to do, but something you already know you will. For both Iris and Ronan, that moment had arrived, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a quiet certainty neither of them could ignore anymore. The city was beginning to shift faster now. Not visibly, but structurally. The patterns Iris had noticed days ago were no longer subtle. Movements that once felt irregular were now repeating, expanding, pushing outward in ways that created pressure where there should have been balance. And pressure, when left unchecked, doesn't stabilize. It breaks. Iris stood at her desk, the same file open again, though now it wasn't confusion that held her attention. Iris closed the file slowly, her fingers resting on it for a brief moment before she lifted her gaze. It looks like preventing something before it escalates, she said. And how do you do that without stepping back into everything you left behind? That question lingered. Because it didn't have a simple answer. You don't, Iris said quietly. Adrian exhaled softly, not in frustration, not in disagreement, but in understanding. So you're going back? No, she said, her voice steady. A small pause. I'm stepping in. The distinction mattered. Because she wasn't returning to who she was. She was moving forward as who she had become. Across the city, Ronan stood in the warehouse once more, though this time the conversation was different. The man in front of him no longer spoke in vague implications or quiet observations. There was clarity now. Direction. They're expanding too quickly, Ronan said. Yes. They don't understand the structure. No. Ronan's gaze sharpened slightly. Then they'll collapse under their own weight. The man nodded once. And take everything with them when they do. Silence followed, heavier now, filled with something more than understanding. Responsibility. You want me to stop it, Ronan said. The man didn't respond immediately. Because the answer was obvious. You're the only one who can, he said finally. Ronan let that settle, not resisting it, not accepting it fully, but acknowledging the truth within it. I'm not rebuilding anything, he said. I know. I'm not taking control. I know. Another pause. Then what exactly am I doing? Ronan asked. The man met his gaze, steady, unwavering. You're correcting a mistake. The simplicity of that answer shifted something. Because it removed everything unnecessary. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about reclaiming anything. It was about preventing something worse. And for the first time since everything had ended, Ronan didn't feel resistance to the idea. He felt clarity. Back in her apartment, Iris stood by the window again, the city stretching out before her, though this time her focus was different. She wasn't observing from a distance anymore. She was analyzing. Preparing. "You're already thinking 10 steps ahead," Adrian said. Iris allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. "I never stopped," she replied. Adrian stepped closer, his presence steady beside her. "And this time?" he asked. Iris turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. "This time," she said, "I don't do it alone." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Because for the first time, she wasn't approaching this as something she had to handle entirely by herself. She was choosing to trust. Adrian held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "That changes things," he said. "Yes," Iris replied. "It does. Because control, when shared, becomes something else entirely. Something stronger. Something more stable. Something that doesn't collapse under pressure." Across the city, Ronan reached a similar understanding. Not about control, but about limitation. For the first time, he wasn't approaching this as the man who once commanded everything. He wasn't trying to rebuild an empire or reassert dominance. He was stepping in with a single purpose: to stop something from breaking. And that purpose was enough. "You'll need access," the man said. "I know. You'll need people." Ronan shook his head slightly. "No," he said. A brief pause. "I need the right ones." Because numbers meant nothing without structure. And structure was something he understood better than anyone. The city continued to move, unaware of the quiet alignment taking place beneath its surface. Two people, separated by distance, by history, by everything they had already ended, were now moving toward the same point. Not because they planned to meet. Not because they intended to reconnect. But because the situation demanded it. And when that happens, paths don't remain separate. They converge. But what neither of them realized, what neither of them could see yet, was that stepping back into something, even for the right reasons, changes more than just the situation. It changes you. It forces you to confront not just what you know, but what you feel. And for Iris and Ronan, that confrontation was coming. Not as conflict. Not as chaos. But as something far more complicated. Because this time, they would not be standing on opposite sides. They would be standing on the same one. And that would change everything. There are moments in life that feel like coincidence, like chance encounters shaped by timing and circumstance. But sometimes, those moments are neither accidental nor unexpected. Sometimes, they are the inevitable result of choices made long before, decisions that set events into motion in ways that cannot be undone. For Iris and Ronan, this was one of those moments. Neither of them had planned to see the other again. Neither of them had wanted to. And yet, here they were. The location was not the rooftop where everything had ended, nor was it a place tied to anything personal. It was neutral, deliberate in its lack of meaning, a private meeting room in a quiet building that stood between districts, neither belonging fully to one side nor the other. It was the kind of place chosen for one reason only: clarity. Iris arrived first. Not because she needed to, but because she preferred to. She stood near the window, her posture calm, her gaze steady as she observed the city below. There was no tension in her expression, no sign of hesitation. If anything, there was only focus, the same quiet, controlled awareness that had guided every decision she had made. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't need to. "You're earlier than I expected." Ronan's voice was different. Not in tone, but in weight. Iris allowed a brief moment to pass before turning to face him. And you're exactly on time, she replied. Their eyes met. And in that single moment, something unspoken passed between them, not emotion, not regret, not even recognition of what they once were to each other. It was understanding. Because whatever they had been was no longer relevant here. You've seen it, Ronan said. Yes. It's unstable. Yes. A brief pause. And it won't hold. Iris tilted her head slightly. No. The conversation was efficient. Direct. Stripped of anything unnecessary. Because this wasn't personal. It couldn't be. Ronan stepped further into the room, his movements controlled, measured, though there was something different in the way he carried himself now. Less weight. Less expectation. You're not here to take control, he said. No. Then why are you here? Iris met his gaze, her expression unchanged. To prevent failure. Ronan nodded once, as if that confirmed what he already suspected. Same reason, he said. Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was aligned. Because for the first time since they had known each other, they were not opposing forces. They were moving toward the same outcome. You understand the structure, Ronan said. Yes. You know where it breaks. Yes. Another pause. Then we don't have time to waste. The words carried urgency, but not panic. Not pressure. Just acknowledgement of reality. Iris stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them slightly, though not enough to create familiarity. Then we don't waste it, she replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because something else had settled into place. Something neither of them had expected to face again. Trust. Not complete. Not unconditional. But functional. And for this. That was enough. Across the city, the instability they had both identified was already beginning to show cracks. Operations that had expanded too quickly were starting to overlap, to interfere with each other, to create friction where coordination should have existed. Small disruptions had already begun, delays, miscommunications, minor conflicts between groups that should have been better than anyone else. I'll handle the financial channels, Iris said. Ronan didn't question it. Then I'll manage the internal structure. No argument. No negotiation. Just division. Efficient. Clean. As if they had done this before. And perhaps, in a way, they had. But this time, it was different. This time, there was no hidden agenda. No imbalance. No misunderstanding. Just purpose. And as they moved into the details, refining the approach, identifying the exact points where intervention would have the greatest impact, something became increasingly clear. This would work. Not because it was perfect, but because it was precise. And precision was something neither of them lacked. You've changed, Ronan said at one point, the observation quiet, almost absent-minded. Iris didn't react immediately. In what way? She asked. Ronan considered the question briefly. You don't hesitate. A small pause. I never did, she replied. Ronan's gaze held hers for a moment longer. No, he said. You just didn't need to act. The difference was subtle. But important. Iris didn't respond. Because there was nothing to correct. Nothing to explain. And after a moment, the conversation returned to what mattered. Because this wasn't about who they had been. It was about what they were doing now. And what needed to be done next. But what neither of them acknowledged. What neither of them allowed themselves to consider. Was that working together, even for the right reasons, changes things. Not immediately. Not obviously. But inevitably. Because proximity creates awareness. And awareness leads to something else. Something neither of them had planned for. something neither of them wanted to complicate what they had already resolved. But as the city continued to shift around them, as their plan moved quietly into motion, as their paths aligned more closely than either of them had intended, that complication was already beginning. And once it fully surfaced, there would be no ignoring it, no separating it, no returning to the distance they had created. Because some connections do not disappear. They wait. And when the moment is right, they return. Not as they were before, but as something entirely new. There is a difference between working together and trusting someone again. One is built on necessity, on shared goals and mutual understanding. The other is something far more fragile, something that cannot be forced, cannot be reconstructed simply because circumstances demand it. And yet, as Iris and Ronan moved forward with a plan that required both precision and restraint, the line between those two things began to blur in ways neither of them had intended. The first moves were subtle, almost invisible. Financial channels shifted quietly under Iris's direction, flows redirected just enough to relieve pressure where it had begun to build. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention. Just small corrections, timed perfectly, executed cleanly, leaving no trace of interference. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like natural adjustment. But it wasn't. It was control. Measured. Intentional. At the same time, Ronan moved through the internal structure, not as a leader reclaiming authority, but as someone observing, identifying weaknesses, reinforcing what could hold and quietly isolating what couldn't. He didn't issue commands. He didn't assert dominance. He adjusted. And in doing so, he began to understand something he had never needed to before. Control is not about force. It's about balance. The city responded. Slowly at first. Then more noticeably. The tension that had been building beneath the surface began to ease, not completely, not permanently, but enough to prevent immediate collapse. Operations that had been colliding started to separate, to reorganize, to find space again. Communication stabilized. Movement aligned. It wasn't perfect. But it was holding. For now. You've slowed it down, Adrian said, his voice carrying quiet observation as he stood behind Iris, watching the data shift in real time. I've redirected it, she corrected. Adrian nodded once. Same result. Temporary, Iris said. A pause. Everything is, Adrian replied. She didn't respond to that. Because he wasn't wrong. Across the city, Ronan stood in the middle of a conversation that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. There were no threats, no power plays, no underlying tension that required dominance. Just information being exchanged, decisions being made based on logic rather than influence. You're not taking over, one of the men said, his tone cautious but curious. No, Ronan replied. Then why help? A brief pause. Because if this fails, Ronan said calmly, you don't recover from it. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair. No challenge. No resistance. Just acceptance. And that, more than anything else, confirmed what Ronan had already begun to realize. He didn't need control to be heard. Back in the quiet space that had become her own, Iris stepped away from her desk, her movements unhurried, her mind still processing the shifting balance she had helped stabilize. It wasn't over. Not even close. But the immediate threat had been contained. For now. You're thinking about him, Adrian said. Iris didn't turn. No, she replied. A small pause. I'm thinking about the system. Adrian stepped closer, his presence steady, his tone calm. He's part of it. That was true. And they both knew it. Iris turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. He understands it, she said. And you trust that? Another pause. This one. Longer. Not completely, she answered. But enough. Adrian nodded, though something in his expression shifted slightly, not in doubt, not in concern, but in recognition of something more complex than either of them had expected. Because, enough is where things begin to change. The next meeting between Iris and Ronan came without tension, without the weight of their past pressing against it. It was different from the rooftop. Different from the first time they had faced each other again. This time, there was rhythm. We've stabilized the outer layers, Ronan said. Yes. But the core is still unstable. Yes. A brief silence. They don't understand long-term structure, he added. They're reacting to immediate gain, Iris replied. Again. Alignment. Ronan exhaled quietly, his gaze steady. We can hold it, he said. But we can't fix it without stepping further in. Iris didn't respond immediately. Because that was the line. Again. The same line they had both approached before. The same line they had both avoided crossing. Then we don't fix it, she said finally. Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly. We let it stabilize on its own? No, Iris replied calmly. We give it structure, and then step away. A pause. Ronan considered that. That requires trust, he said. Iris met his gaze, her expression unchanged. No, she said. It requires discipline. The distinction mattered. Because discipline doesn't depend on someone else. It depends on yourself. And that was something they both had. The plan adjusted. Not expanded. Not deepened. Refined. Focused on creating just enough stability to prevent collapse, without embedding themselves so deeply that they could not leave again. It was a delicate balance. One that required precision. And restraint. But as they worked through it, something else began to surface, not in their words, not in their actions, but in the space between them. Familiarity. Not the kind built on memory. But the kind built on understanding. You don't hesitate, Ronan said again at one point, quieter this time. Iris glanced at him briefly. You noticed that before, she said. Yes. A small pause. But now I understand it. She didn't ask what he meant. And far across the city, Ronan Vex stood in a similar silence, his thoughts moving through the same realization, though from a different direction. Because for the first time since everything had ended, he wasn't just aware of the system. He was aware of her. Not as she had been, but as she was now. And that awareness was changing things. But what neither of them had acknowledged, what neither of them had allowed themselves to define, was that this balance they were maintaining was not just external. It was internal. An internal balance is far more fragile. Because once it shifts, even slightly, everything that follows changes with it. Balance, once found, creates an illusion of control. It convinces you that everything is stable, that every movement has been accounted for, that nothing will deviate beyond what you've already anticipated. But balance is not permanence. It is a temporary state, a fragile alignment that holds only as long as nothing changes. And for Iris and Ronan, something had already begun to change. Not in the system, but in themselves. The structure they had rebuilt, carefully, precisely, with just enough intervention to prevent collapse, was holding. The pressure points had been redirected, the unstable elements contained, the reckless expansion slowed to something manageable. On the surface, everything appeared controlled again. But beneath that surface, something else was shifting. It started with silence. Not the empty kind. But the kind that lingers after a conversation ends, the kind that stays with you longer than it should, replaying details that were never meant to matter. For Iris, that silence came late at night, when the city quieted just enough for her thoughts to settle without distraction. She stood by the window, as she often did, the familiar view stretching out before her. The system was stable. The outcome had been achieved. By all logical measures, this should have been the end. And yet, she hadn't stepped away. Not completely. Her involvement had lessened, yes. The decisions were fewer, the adjustments smaller, the need for constant oversight fading. But she was still there. Still watching. Still aware. And that awareness was no longer about the system. You're still thinking about it. Adrian's voice came softly from behind her, not interrupting, just present. Iris didn't turn. Yes, she said. A pause. But not the way I was before. Adrian stepped closer, his presence steady, familiar in a way that had never demanded attention, only existed when she chose to acknowledge it. Then what is it? He asked. This time, Iris didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was not as clear as it should have been. It's incomplete, she said finally. Adrian studied her for a moment. The system? Iris shook her head slightly. No. And that was all she said. But it was enough. Because Adrian understood. Across the city, Ronan sat alone in a quiet room, the kind that reflected the life he had settled into, simple, functional, untouched by the excess that once defined him. The work was done. The structure was holding. There was no immediate threat, no instability demanding his attention. And yet, he hadn't walked away either. His involvement had diminished, just like hers. The calls were less frequent. The decisions fewer. The necessity fading. But still, he remained connected. Not by obligation. Not by purpose. But by something else. Something he hadn't expected. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment as a thought settled into place, quiet, undeniable. It's not finished. The words left him before he fully processed them. Not because they were logical. But because they were true. And that truth had nothing to do with the system anymore. The next time they met, it wasn't planned. Not in the way their previous meetings had been. There was no message. No arrangement. Just coincidence. Or something that felt like it. They both arrived at the same place for the same reason, a final check, a last confirmation that everything was holding as it should. A quiet location overlooking one of the key districts, neutral ground once again, removed from anything personal. And yet, the moment their eyes met, it didn't feel neutral. You're still here. Ronan's voice was calm, but there was something beneath it now, something less guarded, less distant. Iris didn't react immediately. So are you, she replied. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable. But aware. Because this time, there was no reason for them to be there. Not really. The system is stable, Ronan said. Yes. It will hold. Yes. Another pause. Longer. And yet. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Iris met his gaze, her expression steady, though something deeper had shifted. And yet, she repeated softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because whatever this was, it wasn't about the system anymore. You didn't leave, Ronan said. No. Why? The question was simple. But it carried weight. Because this time, there was no strategic answer. No calculated reasoning. Just truth. Iris held his gaze for a long moment before answering. Because I wasn't done. Ronan's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in understanding. Neither was I. And there it was. Not spoken directly. Not defined. But present. Because sometimes, the reason something feels unfinished is not because the work isn't done, but because something else has yet to be resolved. The air between them changed. Subtly. But undeniably. Not with tension. Not with conflict. But with awareness. You said this was the last time we would speak, Ronan said quietly. Iris didn't look away. That was true, she replied. A small pause. For who we were. The distinction settled into place. Because they were not those people anymore. Not the man who controlled everything. Not the woman who moved in silence behind him. They were something else now. Something new. And that changed everything. Ronan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the city before returning to her. So what happens now? He asked. Iris didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time in a long time, she didn't already know. And that uncertainty didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt real. I don't know, she said. And it was the most honest answer she had given. Because this time, there was no plan. No structure. No defined outcome. Just a moment. And the possibility of what could come next. But what neither of them fully understood yet was that this shift, this quiet, unplanned change in direction, would lead them somewhere neither of them had expected. Not back to the past. Not into something they had already experienced. But into something entirely different. Because when two people change and meet again, they don't recreate what was. They create something new. And that was only just beginning. There are moments in life when everything slows, not because time itself changes, but because awareness deepens. Every word feels heavier, every silence more intentional, every glance more revealing than anything spoken aloud. For Iris and Ronan, that moment had arrived, and neither of them could step away from it anymore. The city no longer demanded their attention. The system they had stabilized continued to hold, functioning within the boundaries they had carefully restored. The imbalance had been corrected, the reckless ambition contained, the fragile structure reinforced just enough to survive on its own. By all logical measures, their involvement was no longer necessary. And yet, they hadn't left. Not completely. Because something else had taken its place. Something quieter. But far more difficult to walk away from. They stood side by side now, not facing each other, but looking out over the city that had once defined so much of who they were. The distance between them was small, not close enough to imply familiarity, not far enough to suggest. I thought once this was done, Ronan began, then paused, as if reconsidering how to finish the thought. You thought it would be over, Iris said. Yes. Another pause. But it's not. Iris turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward him, studying him in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before, not as someone from her past, not as a factor in a system, but as he was now. No, she said quietly. It isn't. The truth settled between them. Not uncomfortable. But undeniable. Because what remained had nothing to do with the system anymore. It had nothing to do with control, or balance, or preventing collapse. It was something else entirely. Something neither of them had prepared for. You changed, Ronan said. Iris didn't look away. So did you. A small pause. Ronan nodded slightly. Not the way I expected. That's usually how it happens, she replied. There was no tension in the exchange. No hidden meaning beyond what was already clear. They had both become something different. And that difference was why this moment existed at all. I used to think I understood everything, Ronan said after a while. Iris raised an eyebrow slightly, though her expression remained composed. And now? He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the city before returning to her. Now I understand what I didn't. Iris didn't ask what he meant. Because she already knew. And for a moment, the weight of that understanding lingered between them, not as regret, not as something to fix, but as something to acknowledge. You don't regret it, Ronan said. It wasn't a question. Iris shook her head slightly. No. A pause. Do you? Ronan didn't answer immediately. Because the question was more complex than it seemed. I regret not seeing it sooner, he said finally. The honesty in his voice wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heavy. It was simple. And because of that, it mattered more. Iris held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, her attention returning to the city below. That wouldn't have changed anything, she said. Ronan studied her quietly. No, he admitted. It wouldn't have. Because who they were back then would not have led them here. And here was something entirely different. The silence returned, but this time it carried something new, not tension, not uncertainty, but recognition. Of what this was. Of what it wasn't. Of what it could become. You're not the same person I left, Ronan said. Iris didn't respond immediately. Neither are you, she said. Another pause. And that matters. Ronan nodded once. Yes, he said. It does. Because whatever existed between them now was not bound by what had come before. It wasn't defined by mistakes. It wasn't shaped by imbalance. It wasn't controlled by anything external. It was something else. Something that existed only in this moment. And that made it uncertain. But also real. What happens if we leave it like this? Ronan asked quietly. Iris turned to face him fully now, her expression calm, but her gaze sharper than before. Then it stays like this, she said. And if we don't? A small pause. This one. Different. Because this question didn't have an immediate answer. Not a logical one. Not a structured one. Just a possibility. Then it changes, she said. Ronan held her gaze, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And you're willing to risk that? Iris didn't hesitate. Yes. The answer was immediate. Certain. Because for the first time, this wasn't about control. It wasn't about certainty. It wasn't about knowing the outcome. It was about choosing something without needing to define it first. Ronan let out a slow breath, something almost like a quiet acknowledgement settling into place. That's new, he said. Yes, Iris replied. It is. And for a moment, everything else fell away. The city. The past. The system they had fixed. The lives they had rebuilt separately. All of it. Leaving only this. This space. This moment. This choice. But what neither of them fully understood yet was that once you choose to let something change, you can't control how it changes. You can't predict what it becomes. You can't return to what it was before. Because change is not something you manage. It's something you step into. And as Iris and Ronan stood there, on the edge of something neither of them had planned for, they were already stepping forward. Not carefully. Not strategically. But willingly. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. There is a moment, in every turning point, when possibility becomes action. It is subtle, so subtle that you don't always recognize it as it happens. There is no clear line drawn, no sound that signals the shift. But something changes. A decision, once abstract, becomes real. And once it does, there is no returning to what existed before. For Iris and Ronan, that moment did not come with urgency. It came with stillness. They were standing in the same place, the city stretching endlessly before them, its lights beginning to glow as evening settled in. Everything around them moved as it always had, cars passing, people living their lives, a rhythm that continued regardless of what happened within it. But for them, time felt different. Not slower, but sharper. More defined. Every second carried weight, every silence held meaning, every word mattered more than it had before. You said it would change, Ronan said quietly. Iris didn't look away from the skyline. Yes. And now? A small pause. This one wasn't hesitation. It was awareness. Now it already has. Ronan studied her profile, the calm certainty in her voice, the absence of doubt. She wasn't questioning the moment. She wasn't trying to control it. She was accepting it. And that was something he had never seen from her before. Not like this. Then what are we doing? He asked. The question was simple. But it carried everything. Because this wasn't about systems, or power, or balance anymore. This was personal. Iris turned to face him fully now, her gaze steady, her posture composed, but there was something beneath it, something new, something unguarded in a way she had never allowed before. We're choosing, she said. Ronan's brow tightened slightly. Choosing what? Another pause. Not long. But deliberate. To not walk away. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything else that had been said. Because walking away would have been easy. It would have been logical. It would have preserved everything they had built separately. But this was something else. And you think that's a good idea? Ronan asked, though there was no real challenge in his tone. Just curiosity. Iris held his gaze without hesitation. No, she said honestly. A faint shift in his expression, almost amusement, but not quite. But you're still doing it, he said. Yes. Another silence. But this one felt different. Less uncertain. More decided. Because something had already been set into motion. You don't do things without reason, Ronan said. I do now. The answer came quickly. Too quickly to be rehearsed. Because it was true. And that truth changed everything. Ronan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment before returning to her. That's dangerous. Yes, Iris agreed. It is. But neither of them stepped back. Because danger, for once, was not something they were trying to avoid. It was something they were choosing to face. Together. The air between them shifted again, subtly but undeniably. The distance that had once been carefully maintained no longer felt necessary. Not because it had disappeared, but because it had lost its purpose. You trust this? Ronan asked. This time, Iris allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I don't need it to. The answer lingered. Because that was the difference. Before, everything had needed to make sense. Now, it just needed to be real. Ronan took a slow breath, something settling into place within him, not resistance, not hesitation, but acceptance. Then he stepped closer. Not abruptly. Not forcefully. Just enough to change the space between them. Iris didn't move away. She didn't step forward either. She simply remained where she was. Meeting him halfway. And in that moment, there were no systems. No past. No future to calculate. Just presence. Just awareness. Just choice. You're not who you were, Ronan said quietly. Neither are you, Iris replied. Another small pause. Good, he said. And for the first time, there was something almost like certainty in his voice. Not about what this would become, but about the fact that it was worth finding out. Because sometimes, the most important step is not knowing where you're going. It's deciding to move forward anyway. But what neither of them could fully see yet was that this choice would not exist in isolation. It would ripple outward. Into everything. Into the lives they had built. Into the stability they had created. Into the balance they had fought to maintain. Because nothing exists separately. Not in their world. Not in any world. And when two people like them choose something uncertain, the consequences are never small. They are never contained. They are never predictable. And what comes next will test not just what they've chosen, but whether they can hold on to it. When everything around them begins to shift again. Every decision creates a ripple. Sometimes small, barely noticeable, fading before it ever reaches the surface. Other times, it expands, moving outward in quiet waves until it touches everything in its path. For Iris and Ronan, the choice they had made, simple in its form, uncertain in its outcome, was not one that would remain contained. It began, as most things do, with something subtle. A shift in rhythm. Not in the city, but in their lives. The days that followed did not feel dramatic. There were no sudden disruptions, no immediate consequences demanding attention. On the surface, everything remained exactly as it had been. The system they had stabilized continued to function, the fragile balance holding steady under the structure they had carefully restored. But beneath that, something was different. Iris noticed it first in herself. Not in her decisions, not in her control, but in the way her attention divided, no longer singular, no longer focused entirely on outcome and precision. There was something else present now, something that didn't follow logic, didn't align with calculation. Distraction. Not careless. Not unfocused. But human. She sat at her desk, reviewing information she would have processed effortlessly before, but this time, her thoughts moved differently. Not slower. Not weaker. Just, elsewhere. You've read the same line 3 times. Adrian's voice was calm, observational as always, but there was something beneath it now, a quiet awareness that something had changed. Iris didn't look up immediately. I know, she said. A pause. But you're not correcting it, he replied. That made her stop. Not because she hadn't noticed, but because she hadn't acted on it. And that was new. She closed the file gently, her fingers resting on its edge for a moment longer than necessary before lifting her gaze to meet his. It's temporary, she said. Adrian studied her for a moment. Is it? The question wasn't confrontational. It wasn't doubtful. It was honest. And honesty, in moments like this, has a way of revealing more than expected. Yes, Iris said. But this time, there was the slightest hesitation. So small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But not by him. Adrian nodded slowly, though his expression remained thoughtful. Then you'll adjust, he said. I always do, she replied. And that was true. But something about the way she said it felt different. Across the city, Ronan experienced the same shift, but in a different form. For him, it wasn't distraction. It was awareness. The kind that lingers longer than it should, that revisits moments without reason, that notices details it once would have dismissed entirely. He moved through his day with the same control, the same quiet discipline he had rebuilt within himself, but there was something else now, something that existed just beneath the surface. Presence. Not of the system. Not of the city. But of her. It wasn't constant. It wasn't overwhelming. But it was there. And it changed the way he moved. The way he thought. The way he paused. He stood by the window of his apartment one evening, the city stretching out before him in a way that had become familiar, almost grounding. And yet, instead of observing it, analyzing it, understanding its patterns, his thoughts shifted elsewhere. Not by force. Not by intention. But naturally. And that alone told him something he could not ignore. You're somewhere else. The voice came from behind him, Victor, his presence quiet but perceptive as always. Ronan didn't turn immediately. Am I? He asked. Victor stepped closer, his gaze steady, his tone carrying a faint hint of something knowing. Yes. A brief silence followed. Then Ronan exhaled slowly. Maybe. Victor didn't press. He didn't need to. Be careful, he said after a moment. Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly. Of what? Victor met his gaze directly. Of thinking this won't change things. The words settled heavily. Because they were true. And Ronan knew it. It already has, he said quietly. Victor nodded once. Yes, he replied. It has. And that was all that needed to be said. Because the consequences of change are not always immediate. But they are always present. The next time Iris and Ronan met, it wasn't for work. Not for the system. Not for necessity. It was intentional. Not arranged in detail. Not planned in structure. But chosen. They stood in a quieter place this time, away from the city center, where the noise softened just enough to allow something else to exist. You didn't have to come, Ronan said. I know, Iris replied. A small pause. Neither did you. Ronan allowed a faint shift in his expression, something almost like acknowledgement. No, he said. But I did. And that was the truth. They were here because they chose to be. Nothing more. Nothing less. The silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It wasn't searching. It was present. You've noticed it, Ronan said. It wasn't a question. Iris met his gaze. Yes. And? A brief pause. This one. More difficult. It complicates things, she said. Ronan nodded slightly. Yes. Another pause. And you don't like that? Iris considered the statement. I don't need to like it, she replied. I just need to decide what to do with it. The answer was precise. Controlled. But not dismissive. Because she wasn't ignoring it. She was acknowledging it. And that alone meant everything had already changed. Ronan studied her for a moment, something thoughtful moving behind his eyes. And what have you decided? He asked. Iris held his gaze, her expression steady, but this time, there was something beneath it. Something less guarded. I haven't, she said. And it was the truth. Because for the first time in a long time, she didn't have a clear answer. Ronan exhaled quietly, something settling into place within him. Neither have I. The admission was simple. But it carried weight. Because uncertainty was not something either of them was used to. And yet, here it was. And that made it dangerous in a way neither of them had ever had to face before. Because you cannot control something that has no structure. And for the first time, they weren't trying to. The city had stabilized. The system they had intervened in continued to function, no longer on the edge of collapse, no longer driven by reckless expansion. The fragile balance they had restored was holding, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to ensure that what came next would not be chaos. Their work was done. And yet, they remained. Not because they were needed, but because something else had taken its place. They stood together again, not in the same exact place as before, but in a space that felt similar, quiet, removed, untouched by the noise of everything around it. It was no longer about where they met. It was about why. You could leave, Ronan said. Iris glanced at him briefly, her expression calm, steady. So could you, she replied. A faint shift in his posture, something that might have been a quiet acknowledgement. Yes. A pause. But I'm not. Iris looked at him fully now, studying him in a way that no longer held distance, no longer carried the detachment she had once maintained so carefully. Neither am I, she said. And that was the truth. Simple. Unavoidable. They weren't here because of the system. They weren't here because of obligation. They were here because they had chosen to be. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was understood. You said you trust yourself, Ronan said after a moment. I do. And this? A small pause. Iris didn't look away. This is part of that. Ronan held her gaze, something shifting behind his eyes, not hesitation, not doubt, but something quieter. Acceptance. Then I won't question it, he said. And for him, that was a decision. Because for a man who had once questioned everything, who had once controlled every outcome, choosing not to question something was its own kind of trust. The air between them changed again, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough to be felt. The distance that had once defined them no longer existed in the same way. Not because it had disappeared, but because it no longer mattered. You know this doesn't come with guarantees, Ronan said. I know. No certainty. I know. Another pause. No control. This time, Iris allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. That's the point. Ronan exhaled quietly, something settling into place within him. Because for the first time, he understood that. Understood that not everything needed to be controlled. Not everything needed to be predicted. Some things simply needed to be experienced. And that realization changed everything. You're not who you were, he said. Iris tilted her head slightly. Neither are you. A brief silence followed. Then Ronan nodded once. Good. Because whatever this was, it required them to be different. It required them to not repeat the past. To not fall into the same patterns, the same mistakes, the same imbalance that had once defined everything between them. And for the first time, that felt possible. The city stretched out before them, unchanged in its movement, in its rhythm, in its quiet indifference to everything happening within it. People continued their lives, unaware of the subtle shifts taking place in the lives of two individuals who had once moved within its structure like forces of nature. Now, they were something else. Something quieter. Something more grounded. Something real. What happens now? Ronan asked. Iris didn't answer immediately. Because this time, there was no plan waiting. No strategy to follow. No outcome to predict. Just a question. And the freedom to choose the answer. She looked out at the city for a moment longer, then back at him. We find out, she said. The simplicity of the words carried more meaning than anything else. Because finding out meant stepping forward without certainty. Without control. Without knowing where it would lead. And choosing to do it anyway. Ronan held her gaze, something steady, something certain, not about the future, but about the decision itself. Together, he asked. A small pause. But not hesitation. Just acknowledgement. Yes, Iris said. And that was it. No dramatic shift. No overwhelming moment. Just a decision. Quiet. Intentional. Final. Because sometimes, the most important endings are actually beginnings. And as they stood there, no longer defined by what had come before, no longer bound by the roles they had once played, they stepped into something new. Not perfect. Not guaranteed. But real. And that was enough. Because in the end, it was never about power. It was never about control. It was never about the system they had built, broken, and rebuilt again. It was about two people who had changed. And found each other again, not as they were, but as they had become. And this time, they weren't holding on to anything out of necessity. They weren't staying because they had to. They were choosing it. Every moment. Every step. Every unknown piece of the future waiting ahead. And whatever that future became, it would not be shaped by the past. It would not be defined by mistakes. It would not be controlled. It would be lived. Together.